kind of the building blocks of heredity, kind of where it comes from. So within every cell is a nucleus, and within that nucleus is the genetic material. That genetic material is found on chromosomes. And so those chromosomes are made up of coils of DNA, and on those coils of DNA are our genes. And our genes are what affect everything that DNA controls, right? It all goes down to the genes. What genes do we have? So there are two different ways that our cells replicate and pass on our genetic information. So with the exception of one type of cell in our body, all of the rest of our cells use mitosis to divide. And mitosis just means that they create a duplicate copy of themselves. Now things can go wrong when we make that copy, or we can have mutations, but in general, that cell that results from, or two cells that result from mitosis are exactly the same as the parent cell. Now the one cell that doesn't divide this way is our gametes, right? So if you are male, your sperm; if you are female, your ova, or what we also refer to as eggs. It's really important that those don't have all of the cells, because they have to combine to create an embryo, right? So when your sperm and ova divide, they only pass on half of their genetic information, so that when that ova and that sperm meet during conception, then there's a complete copy of genetic material, a complete version of genetic material. And if you're wondering what human chromosomes look like, here is an image. So you can see 22 pairs of chromosomes, and for the most part, those chromosomes look really similar, right? They kind of match one another, and that is essentially because they have genes on each one of those chromosomes that match one another, and that's going to be important for what we're about to talk about in a second. And then down in the right hand bottom corner, you can see a pair of X chromosomes and a Y chromosome. If you have two X chromosomes, as the pair there does, you are genetically female. If you have one X and one Y, which you can see the tiny little Y chromosome there in the corner, that makes you male. And then we'll look at what happens when you have more or less of different chromosomes a little bit later in this little mini lecture. So some other key terms to be aware of when it comes to inheritance are genotype and phenotype. So a genotype is your genetic material. So that image on that last slide, right? This is the genes that you have, that if someone were to look at your genes, this is what they would see genetically, your DNA profile. But we don't express our genes the same way. And sometimes we don't express something that we have genetically because of the way it's passed on. So what we actually see based on our genes is our phenotype, the features that we actually express. Now, whether or not we express something goes down to patterns of inheritance. And so for each type of genes, you can remember you have two chromosomes. So you have a copy of a gene on one chromosome and the other. If those copies are the same, you are homozygous. So if you remember back to high school biology, you might have done these Punnett squares here, and you can see that in this instance, the genes are either a capital Y or a lowercase y, and they've also color-coded them for us to make it a little bit easier to see. So if you have two copies of the lowercase y, that green lowercase y, you are homozygous. Or if you have two copies of this uppercase y, that it happens to be yellow, you are homozygous. If you have two different copies of the genes, so on one chromosome you have an uppercase, and on the other you have a lowercase, that makes you heterozygous. So you can see that here. There's an uppercase Y and a lowercase y. And that's important because of the way we pass our genes on and what we express. So let's look at that on the next slide. So there are two ways that are kind of simple to look at that we inherit things. So we have dominant and recessive. And so if a trait is dominant, all you have to have is one copy of the gene in order to express that trait. So things like dimples and curly hair and dark colored hair happen to be dominant. So if you get one of those copies of the genes from either parent, you're going to show that characteristic or trait. On the other hand, you have recessive. Recessive means that you need to have both copies of that gene in order to express it. And so you have to get it from both of your genetic parents or your biological parents. Those happen to be things like having red hair or being nearsighted or having straight hair. Those are less likely to happen because you have to get both copies of the genes. Now, most things aren't that simple. It's not just a matter of one pair of genes that we have to look at. So those things we refer to as having a polygenic pattern of inheritance. There's multiple genes that all intertwine to affect how a trait is expressed. Eye color is one of those things. We used to think that it was kind of a dominant recessive type of inheritance, but now we know that it's actually more complex than that. So many things are actually polygenic.